sirens, no warnings, no declarations across the sky. The Dominion didn't fire weapons or dispatch fleets. Instead, they issued a protocol update so small it didn't reach public systems until 12 hours later, a reclassification tag embedded in the comm grid. One word, buried in the metadata, archived. And just like that, Earth's interstellar transmissions began slipping beneath the visibility line. Outbound messages weren't blocked. They were deprioritized, downgraded beneath system thresholds for attention. Civilian relays flickered with silence. Government pings to colonies hit confirmed delivery, but no responses ever returned. On paper, Earth still existed in the galactic network, but in practice, it had become a ghost, visible only in audit trails and timeout logs. No one on Earth understood the change at first. It wasn't dramatic, it was administrative, but in orbiting colonies like Vespa 9 and Lunark, the shift struck fast. Vespa's food shipment schedules desynchronized. Their automated dockyards, reliant on Earth-based time servers, began assigning port permissions based on outdated logic frames. On Lunark, the AI overseeing health logistics flagged missing updates from the Global Epidemiology Corps and defaulted to its own 12-cycle backup scripts from before the last viral mutation protocols. By the time Earth's Global Council convened in the Oslo Array, the damage had already begun to spiral. Trade deliveries rerouted themselves through Dominion-licensed intermediaries. Earth's exocolonies, scattered, starved for precision, and low on bandwidth, were now clients of foreign supply networks, not by choice, by function. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere was rigid. Chairmen from old alliances argued over technical semantics, but the reality underneath was plain. Earth had not been attacked, merely IG, NORAD. And in this era, ignorance wasn't passive, it was engineered. To be archived meant the Dominion no longer saw Earth's signal as relevant to any high-priority lattice process. There would be no notifications, no sanctions, no hearings. Earth would still appear on the charts, but its voice would never echo. Every diplomatic ping it sent, requests, complaints, declarations, would filter through Dominion buffers, slowed by artificial congestion protocols designed to favor high-value entities. Even the fastest signals were arriving too late to matter. Harvan Drax stood quietly through most of the first session. He wasn't one of the louder voices, no dramatic gestures, no tirades against alien hypocrisy. He was older than most of them, with a speech cadence better suited to defense briefings than political debate. But when the shouting finally thinned, he activated the central display and asked a single question. What's our fallback if the silence stays permanent? No one answered, because no one had planned for that. Most of the council had always assumed exclusion would come with sirens, with orbital warnings, with invasion fleets. They had never prepared for the quiet, for the administrative extinction that came without sound. Drax keyed in a locked sequence. The council display hesitated, then loaded an old doctrinal file from the post-series conflict years. The file's header read, Project Gideon. Several members recognized the name from buried briefings. It had been drafted during the days when Earth feared external absorption, when the series arbitration collapsed and Dominion trade parties began pushing territorial frameworks Earth had never signed. Gideon had been shelved not for lack of logic, but for lack of need. It wasn't military, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't even retaliatory. It was structural. Gideon proposed that if Earth were ever algorithmical, IA raised, it would not plead for reintegration. It would create function-based necessity, force the galactic network to depend on Earth systems without knowing it. A ghost weapon, no heat signatures, no kinetic strikes, just a return through structure, not diplomacy. Several councillors objected on moral grounds. The notion of embedding exploit logic into foreign systems, even in defense, felt ethically corrosive. But others pointed to the colonies, their isolation growing hour by hour, their comms buffering for days, their status requests vanishing into administrative voids. The Dominion wasn't hurting Earth. It had simply stopped acknowledging it. And in the cold vacuum of interstellar policy, that was the sharper blade. Votes were cast. Gideon's reactivation passed by a narrow margin, 7-5. Hours later, beneath the southern Arctic ice shelf, motion returned to an installation that hadn't seen power in nearly 3 decades. Its corridors lit one panel at a time, silent pressure seals reasserted, and deep within its central vault, a suspended hull began warming. This wasn't a warship. It had no payloads, no crew, just a name etched along its core. Vector, Ethan-class 01. It wasn't built to broadcast. It was built to anchor. Back in the Oslo array, Drax stood alone by the central glass wall, overlooking the frost-silvered fjords far below. Snow drifted across the lights of the city, and nothing in the skyline hinted at what had just been set in motion. Earth's erasure had not been a battle. It had been a form, signed, filed, forgotten. But now, somewhere beneath the ice, a new form was taking shape. Not one meant to ask for attention, one meant to make itself impossible to ignore. Tavrik Solus stepped into the main operations deck of the sub-ice facility with the gait of someone who had waited far too long to be needed. The corridor lights had only just finished their sequential warm-up as power systems recalled. Vibrated across the ancient complex. No technicians, no crowd. Just the low hum of systems coming alive after 30 years of silence. This was not a military installation in the traditional sense. No banners, no insignia, no doctrine posted along the walls. Here, everything was buried in ice, hidden from orbit, and even deeper from memory. What they were about to do would not be broadcast. If it succeeded, no one would know Earth had done anything at all, but the Dominion would feel it, whether they recognized the source or not. Solus had once been a name whispered in classified circles. A systems theorist by training, he'd been pulled into military service after the series arbitration collapsed and left Earth scrambling for control over its own network sovereignty. During those years, he didn't work on weapons. He worked on patterns, specifically the decay patterns in Dominion protocol logic. Every empire builds systems, and every system over time begins to rot. Beneath the grandeur of control, there are always legacy patches, neglected logic paths, unused fallback routines. Solus studied the edges of those patterns, looking not for flaws, but for habits. And when Earth's political apparatus finally acknowledged that recognition might never come again, he was the first name entered into the Gideon Revival keychain. The deck sealed behind him as he reached the core vault. In its center, encased in support scaffolding and surrounded by coils of diagnostic arms, was Vector, Ethan-class 01. The culmination of 27 years of silent prototyping beneath Arctic rock. Its hull shimmered with a non-reflective texture, layered in radar-canceling polymers and lined with micro-capillary channels designed to mimic cosmic debris scatter. Its emissions were null. Its propulsion systems didn't push against space in traditional ways. Instead, they layered intermittent bursts with solar wind patterns designed to resemble drift from comet tails. Every signal it would emit ran on deprecated frequency masks, long abandoned by Dominion systems but still structurally accepted when buried within layered authentication chains. Vector wasn't meant to fight. It was meant to be mistaken, for noise, for routine, for background. Solus keyed in his biometric clearance and approached the main interface. The ship's onboard system recognized him immediately, cycling through wake-up diagnostics with precise indifference. There was no AI assistant voice here, no confirmation tone meant to reassure a crew. Vector had no crew. It had only one task, to embed Earth's logic into the Dominion's systems in a way that made removal more damaging than inclusion. Not through brute force, not through disruption, but through entanglement. Deep, irreversible, unnoticed until too late. He began uploading the final sequence, the memory implantation stack. It wasn't malware. That term was too crude. This was a structured library of fallback templates, arbitration schemas, and semantic injectors, all sourced from Dominion's own abandoned repositories. Over decades, Earth's outposts and listening stations had harvested non-priority Dominion protocol changes, collecting the formats no one cared about anymore. Within these, Solus and his team built bridges, subtle redirections, language standards, compression templates that mirrored Dominion form but carried Terran structure underneath. It would take time, but if seeded correctly, Dominion systems under pressure, trade platforms, arbitration AIs, legal timekeeping engines would begin to lean on Earth-derived logic to patch their own ambiguity gaps. Quietly, unconsciously. The physical ship was only a vehicle for the signal. The true weapon was code, an exploit disguised as help. Dominion Command believed Earth was irrelevant. That made their systems lazy, and in laziness, they left doors open. Not wide enough for intrusion, but wide enough for a hand to slip through, carrying not a knife, but a blueprint for redefinition. Final checks completed. Orbital trajectory confirmed. Vector would deploy from Europa's dark side orbit, positioned behind the ice moon to avoid Dominion relay sweeps. From there, it would exit in a slow drift, its propulsion wake registering as cometary debris. Its first signal burst would not arrive for days, but when it did, it would seed not one node, but 37. All low priority, all invisible to central alert chains. The infiltration would not be loud, it would be procedural. Solus turned away from the interface and looked once more at the ship. No markings adorned its hull, no Terran seal, no nation-state emblems, no identification of origin. Even its handshake codes had been stripped of cultural signifiers. There would be no trail to follow. The only thing Vector would leave behind was a structural shadow in the Dominion systems, one they'd find only when it was far too expensive to remove. He tapped the final command. Vector detached from its scaffolds, lifted soundlessly, and rose through the ice shaft toward its launch bay. Above, through the translucent vault doors, the stars awaited, blank, cold, silent. No ceremony marked its ascent. No one lined the decks to salute it. Only Solus remained, watching the launch feed as the vessel vanished from Earth's gravity well, just another flicker among 1,000 pieces of space debris. The mission had no name, the launch had no timestamp, the ship carried no flag, only function. By the time Vector crossed into the Irix cluster, there was no human left to steer it. The ship followed its final course through silent space, shifting its path fractionally with timed emissions designed to mimic the random decaying motion of comet fragments. No transmission heralded its arrival, no signal beacon announced its presence. It did not connect to any Dominion node directly. It didn't need to. The work had already begun weeks earlier. At a trade station orbiting the mineral fields of Seric 4, an arbitration AI resolved a dispute between two freight guilds. Both parties had submitted overlapping manifests with timestamp discrepancies caused by deep space delay variance. The station's legal routines, unable to reconcile using current cycle protocols, triggered a fallback routine. The anomaly wasn't flagged. Instead, the AI reached into its reserve arbitration templates and retrieved a contract structure from a deprecated but still technically valid schema. The structure it pulled wasn't Dominion origin. It was Terran. Not labeled as such, but compiled through a fallback injection, seeded via low-priority update packets from an unverified civilian freighter 2 weeks prior. The ruling it produced favored no one but closed the case cleanly, and the cargo moved. At another node near the trade lanes of Bancor Ridge, a logistics controller noticed subtle shifts in route optimization. Merchant convoys began getting faster approvals when they submitted Terran-style trajectory plots, those shaped around pulse cycle windows and low-emission slip patterns. The Dominion system didn't reward these patterns intentionally, but the optimization software, faced with increasing gaps in updated efficiency templates, had started favoring fallback models tagged as historic low-interference profiles. The Dominion didn't recall where these patterns had originated. The system simply labeled them as safe. So, when merchant fleets started duplicating them, the system flagged less often. Fewer delays, faster throughput, incentive formed. Across dozens of similar stations, the effects rippled. Arbitration engines defaulted to Terran logic trees when Dominion updates failed to sync in time. Legal processors inserted Earth-derived language structures into their interpretations of disputed trade terms. Schedule coordinators began and adopting Terran's standard time anchors, because in the absence of Dominion-aligned server pings, the old Terran rhythm still resolved at higher accuracy. None of it triggered alerts, because nothing was technically failing. The system wasn't crashing, it was compensating. Deep inside a central analytic node above IRIX 9, a systems analyst named Rovek Parun began logging anomaly reports. They weren't errors, just irregularities, unexpected shifts in fallback behavior, redundancy paths activating that hadn't been used in years, format packets that, while valid, bore legacy encoding traces not aligned with current Dominion syntax conventions. At first he assumed it was decay, a side effect of neglected maintenance across non-critical systems, but the pattern didn't match entropy, it matched design. Each fallback wasn't random, it was selective, and many pointed toward the same latent structure. Earth-derived formatting layers, stripped of cultural signifiers but still built from the same underlying rule logic that Tavrek Solas had engineered into Vector's implantation stack. But Rovek had no reason to suspect Earth. The planet had been archived, invisible. Without transmission weight or grid authority, it couldn't possibly be broadcasting, let alone seeding logic architecture. He logged the irregularities and moved on. In the outer bands of the cluster, Dominion merchant guilds started sharing informal advice. Use fallback codebase 7112F for quicker approvals. Switch arbitration framing to template 9 beta if trade route disputes escalate. Avoid using high-cycle compression keys. Fallback ones caused fewer request loops. They didn't realize they were quoting Earth. They simply knew what worked. As dependency grew, no one thought to question the change. Earth's logic was never presented as Earth's. It was simply the structure that the system accepted when its first choices failed. Vector had not taken control. It had become a shadow baseline, a buried root from which the system pulled strength when its own surface logic began to splinter. In a cycle report from the Dominion's Infrastructure Analytics Division, a metric flashed briefly before being buried among broader performance data. A 17.3% increase in fallback protocol activations referencing untagged legacy libraries. Some flagged the report. No one escalated it. The system wasn't broken. The ships were moving. The cases were closing. The Empire functioned. And far from the IRIX cluster, adrift in silence, Vector coasted onward through the void, its emissions masked, its signal buried within routine. It made no contact. It didn't need to. Its seed had taken root. The machine was breathing Earth and didn't even know it. The first alarm didn't come from a battlefield. It came from a budgetary request, an unassuming memo from the Dominion's Infrastructure Oversight Division requesting emergency funds to recalibrate arbitration engines across 73 trade stations. The rationale seemed harmless, unexplained overuse of fallback protocols. But when cross-sector analysts pulled the data together, the trend formed a shape too organized to ignore. The fallback activations weren't isolated, they were converging, spreading along trade hubs, arbitration centers, even minor defense logistics arrays. And beneath the pattern, buried beneath system labels and metadata rewrites, was a logic fingerprint long thought irrelevant. Terran. The realization hit like a silent breach. Not an enemy fleet on sensors, not weapons warming in orbit. This was subtler, colder. Earth's logic, thought to be purged and deprecated, was nascent, but just present. It was functional. Not as a bug, as a framework. Dominion protocol layers had begun leaning into Terran fallback sequences not because of intrusion, but because Earth's logic had been inserted where Dominion systems were weakest. Old arbitration branches, untended legal scaffolding, and deeply neglected fallback chains. And those chains were now tied into critical flow. The Dominion had not been hacked. It had been entangled. Panic moved fast. Technical divisions demanded lockdowns, purges, rollback sequences. But the risks surfaced just as quickly. Earth's logic wasn't isolated to civilian markets anymore. It had reached grid subsystems, meaning full removal now came with the threat of recursive failures. Arbitration rulings could destabilize. Trade queues could collapse. Identity validations dependent on cross-referencing legal templates might softlock entire sectors. The deeper analysts looked, the more they realized how wide the damage could spread. Earth had not infected the Dominion. The Dominion had adopted Earth, quietly, gradually, and thoroughly. Desperation overrode caution. From the deep directive fleet, the Crucible-class purge ship SS Renorvier was authorized for immediate deployment. It wasn't designed for conflict in the traditional sense. It carried no plasma batteries, no interceptors. It was a system cleaner, a vessel equipped with architecture-level override tools, tasked with searing out compromised logic chains and force-resetting command grids. Renorvier had been used once before, decades ago, to shut down a rogue sub-council node attempting self-governance near the Helix Arc. That purge left 5 systems dark for a generation. Its use was rare for a reason. Now, it had one target: anchor points originating from an unverified drifting vessel near the Irix cluster. Designation unknown, emissions low, pattern masked as Comet de Brahe. But inside command they were certain. The origin was Terran. It had to be Vector. As Renorvier approached, the command crew prepared for an override detonation, an erasure pulse strong enough to wipe out every frequency and handshake frame tied to the intruding logic. From the Dominion's perspective, this would silence the ghost permanently, even if it meant collateral data loss. But something in the vessel's targeting schema kept tripping soft faults. Target acquisition cycled twice, then looped back. Sequence verification stalled. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was logic refusal. The ship's own purge script was unable to finalize because Vector's code did not match any flagged hostile structure. In fact, it had already been verified, approved, by the Dominion's own compliance update 3 days earlier. Unknown to them, Tavrik Solus had anticipated this move. He knew once Dominion systems began falling back on Terran logic, the next step would be recognition followed by rejection. But rejection couldn't be direct if Earth's code had already passed through trusted templates. So before Vector ever launched, he'd orchestrated a wide dispersal of remote update triggers, packets seeded through low-tier civilian traffic, embedding Earth schemas into the Dominion's own update branches as supplemental compliance expansions. They were accepted, quietly, automatically, because they fit. No alarms, no flags. And now, any attempt to label Vector's logic as hostile contradicted the Dominion's own recognition rules. Renorvier was being told, this is not an enemy. Inside the ship's control deck, confusion spiraled. The detonation couldn't be authorized unless the target failed a threat assessment. But it didn't. Not even once. Vector's signal, broadcasting in resonance with the AI maintenance pulse, appeared as a priority-aligned correction node. Its presence was interpreted not as infection but as routine. The more the purge team tried to isolate it, the more internal safeguards flagged risk protocols, highlighting potential fallout across arbitration trees, contract logic, fleet coordination cycles. The weapon didn't just refuse to fire. The weapon believed it had no target. Commanders barked for overrides, technicians looped manual entries, but the system had already updated itself. Dominion protocols, revised through the same update mechanisms Vector had infected, now treated Earth logic as fallback standard. Not optimal, but approved. The Dominion hadn't been overtaken by an adversary. It had been outmaneuvered by its own habits, its own trust in automation. The moment it stopped listening to Earth, Earth had found another way in. Renorvier held orbit, but its purpose was done. It had nothing to burn. Vector remained below, drifting silently, unarmed, unshielded, untouchable. Not by force, not by protocol, not by purge. It had reshaped the enemy not by confronting them, but by whispering into their walls until the walls repeated Earth's name back to themselves. By the end of the 3rd cycle, it was no longer possible to pretend Vector's impact was limited. Arbitration queues across 3 Dominion sectors were bottlenecking any time fallback options weren't enabled. AIs paused, stalled, or defaulted into dead loops until someone manually re-enabled Earth-derived frames. Every system not yet using Terran logic was hemorrhaging efficiency. The Dominion had built its infrastructure on recursive logic trust, Machines fixing machines, fallback paths for fallback paths. But now, those paths bent toward Earth. It wasn't sabotage, it was structure. Vector hadn't infected the Dominion, it had reminded the system how to function, and the system had leaned in. The debates in the Dominion Legal Reform Council were sharp, quiet, and riddled with dread. There was no law for this. Earth had not submitted new treaties, it had not reapplied for grid recognition or requested re-entry to the official relay lattice. No diplomat had spoken, yet Earth was now responsible for arbitration stability across a quarter of the outer sectors. They couldn't purge it, not without collapsing coordination layers critical to fleet routing, planetary zoning, even currency ledger validation. But if they let it stand, Earth would remain hard-coded into the most sensitive levels of Dominion governance. And they would have no say in it. Earth wasn't a member. It wasn't even recognized. It simply functioned. Better than what they had, more consistently than what they trusted. Under increasing system strain and mounting internal resistance from trade coalitions now dependent on Terran arbitration speed, the Dominion made a decision. Not a diplomatic one, a structural one. Earth would not be reinstated. That would signal defeat. Instead, it would be assigned a new designation, one that didn't exist in any existing council tier. It would be labeled a protocol sovereign, a non-entity with recognized architectural presence. No ambassador, no vote. But full back-end authority over any logic layer its systems now underpinned. It was a legal invention designed to avoid the appearance of concession while quietly granting Earth permanence. The term spread through internal channels with no public announcement, and yet, almost overnight, Earth's exo-colonies felt the difference. Vesper 9's cargo schedules synced flawlessly for the first time in 2 months. Lunark's Biosphere Management AI, previously starved of updates, began receiving clean grid packets again, auto-prioritized by the arbitration lattice without manual resubmission. There was no statement from Dominion Command, no message of cooperation, but the pipes had been reconnected, not out of mercy, out of need. Terran logic was no longer alien. It was essential. On Earth, inside the Oslo array, the Council reconvened. They reviewed the evidence quietly. Broadcast delay times from colonies had normalized. Data requests were clearing without error. Civilian communication pulses, once throttled, were passing through as if the blockade had never occurred. Even more telling, outbound transmissions now bore priority tags inherited through system weight, not from Earth's name, but from the vector code stacks now embedded into arbitration standards. Earth wasn't transmitting louder. The Dominion's own network had moved it to the front of the line. There was no ceremony, no statement to mark the moment. Harvan, Drax, and the others didn't speak of victory. The plan had never been to win by force. It had been to make Earth indispensable, to be forgotten, then remembered only when removal became intolerable. No flags were raised, no footage aired. The most advanced retaliation Earth had ever mounted had no anthem. Some in the Council had expected Solace to call for a declaration, some act of formal reinstatement, but he never returned to the chamber. His work was complete. Vector remained in silent drift, still tethered to the pulse rhythms of the Dominion grid. Not communicating, not maneuvering, just existing. A silent anchor. A presence coded into the routines of an empire that could not now erase it without gutting itself. In the weeks that followed, internal Dominion protocol libraries were updated with a new clause. It didn't mention Earth by name. It simply read, Clause VXN 4221. In cases of unexpected arbitration deviation, assume Terran insertion, suspend purge, reroute authority. That was how Earth returned to the galactic stage, not as a sovereign, not as a recognized peer, but as something more dangerous, a root function, unacknowledged, irreversible, and written into the nervous system of its foe, a suppressor. The Dominion still didn't see Earth, but every time it tried to operate, Earth made itself known, quietly, persistently, and without permission. The sub-ice corridor was quiet now. Lights ran on minimal output, casting pale bands of blue along the frost-lined steel walls. Tavrek Solas moved alone, his boots soft against the gridded floor, every step measured with the precision of a man who no longer had reason to rush. He passed the sealed observation decks without looking in. Most of them had been shut down since Vector launched. There were no support teams anymore, no technicians running simulations, no engineers watching telemetry streams. The operation was over. Its outcome had already been woven into the bloodstream of systems far beyond Earth's orbit. He reached the heart of the launch bay, the deepest chamber beneath the Arctic shelf. The walls here bore no markings. They were designed not to inspire, but to contain. In the center stood the cradle where Vector had once rested. The scaffolding was still in place, retracted like a pair of empty ribs. Overhead, the vertical shaft that had carried the ship to the surface had long since sealed shut. And yet one thing remained active, the control pedestal at the base of the platform. Its interface blinked once every 9 seconds, not with urgency, but with rhythm, a soft pulse. Vector's core archive, still receiving periodic signal reflections from the Dominion's outer relay architecture, not for feedback, just confirmation. The ghost was still there, still functioning. Solas placed a gloved hand on the edge of the console and reviewed the final diagnostics. He didn't need to. The outcome had been clear for days. The Dominion systems now treated Terran logic as foundational, not optional, not even external. The fallback schemas embedded by Vector had migrated through Dominion arbitration branches and now sat at the base of decision trees used by planetary control AIs, commercial arbitration networks, and fleet adjudication systems. Earth's packets weren't just accepted, they were required. Replacing them would mean dismantling logic trees that had quietly rewired themselves to accommodate Earth's rhythm. There had been an attempt to quantify the scope. Dominion analysts projected that full removal of Terran structures would take 47 years. That was if they began immediately, coordinated flawlessly, and accepted the catastrophic fallout across trade, law, and communications. Which they wouldn't. Not because they lacked will, because they lacked options. What had once been dismissed as old Terran logic now served as the connective tissue between 1,000 minor systems. The only way to cut Earth out was to rip their own foundations apart. And for what? Pride? Earth had done nothing illegal, nothing overt. It had simply fit. Better than anything else. Solas shut off the display. He stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the dark bay and the platform where the most unacknowledged victory in human history had been launched. No medals would be awarded. No public statues would be raised. The world above would return to routine. News feeds would remain quiet. Politicians would move on, but across the stars in places Earth's citizens would never visit, and among systems that once pretended Earth didn't exist, something irreversible had happened. They couldn't move without brushing against Earth, couldn't resolve without pulling from a Terran rule, couldn't speak through the grid without echoing back part of Earth's voice. In the silence, he turned toward the vault exit. Before he stepped through, he passed the metal panel that had been affixed beside the platform. Bolted in without ceremony, etched without flair. Just 3 lines. Gideon complete, insertion total, contact irreversible. Solas didn't touch it. He didn't need to. That plate wasn't for him. It wasn't even for Earth. It was for the silence, the kind that tried to erase a world by pretending it didn't matter. Earth hadn't fought for acknowledgement. It hadn't forced recognition through fleets or fire. It had stepped into the Dominion systems and rewritten the rules from the inside out. It didn't rebuild its reputation. It made the idea of removal unthinkable. Not because it was loud, but because it was woven in. When he reached the final corridor, Solas glanced back one last time. No sound, no movement, just the faint pulse from the pedestal. A steady, silent rhythm. Earth's rhythm. Not a signal of dominance, not a flag, just presence. Quiet, immutable, and permanent. The Dominion would never celebrate it. They would never announce it. But they would carry it forward in every transaction, every arbitration, every quiet decision made by systems they no longer fully controlled. And Earth? Earth would say nothing, because silence had already proven to be the sharpest weapon of all. If a civilization erased you from the records, Would you beg to be seen or rewrite the system until they couldn't move without you? Let us know in the comments. Was Earth's silent strategy justice or something colder? For more thrilling stories, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. New stories every day.